Very much. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Dodge City with all of you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, I'm willing to pull up the microphone, but freeze my hands a little bit if I don't. On your tables, you have a copy of this year's Ford County Housing Outlook that we put together every year. And we do that, it's available to us because of the generous support of Security First Title. And so I want to make sure that we give them special thanks for that, because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have the resources to be able to put together the nice publications we do. I'll also just mention that on the back table over there are copies of the larger housing forecast publications that we do for the state's 5 metropolitan areas. And if those are of interest to you, then please feel free to take any of those that you would like with you. And finally, before I jump in, I'll just mention the partnership that we have with the Kansas Association of Realtors and all of the local boards, including the Dodge City Board of Realtors. Every month, through a contract that we have with the Kansas Association of Realtors, every month we access the local MLS statistics, make them all talk to each other so that we can actually prepare statewide statistical reports. But we also prepare reports for the local market. And so if you're looking for detailed information about local housing markets, contact the Dodge City Board of Realtors. They have those data through this, and we're grateful for that partnership that we have. If you're interested, the slides from my presentation, I think they're available on the center's website, which was shown before, but they're also available on the Center for Real Estate website. That address is realestate.wichita.edu or simply wichita.edu/realestate. Either of those will get you there, but please do not point your phone at the distorted images there on the side. That is not a QR code. I will not be held responsible for what pops up on your phone if you click on it. But that does kind of bring up the theme that we have with this year's forecast. Every year, like Jeremy, I try and have a theme. And for me, the theme was that we've been in such a strange time that it's been difficult to tune in. You remember the old tube TVs where sometimes the signal would get fuzzy? That's the way things have felt here. So that was the theme that we went. We'll talk about some of the distortions that we've been working through in housing markets as I go forward. When I do my annual housing forecast, I always look at 2 fundamentals to try and say, what will demand be for housing? So how will the housing market do? One of those fundamentals is the labor market. And Jeremy talked about that earlier. Essentially, that side of the equation is very strong as it relates to housing. People who want jobs, have jobs. That this is, the problem we have is not people being unemployed, it's about finding people to employ. So from that standpoint, the labor market is creating strong demand for housing. The other fundamental that I look at is the financing side. What can people get the money they need to buy the houses? Very few of us are able to afford to just pay cash to buy the home up front. We need a loan. And the thing that has happened here recently has been the rapid increase in mortgage rates. Went up to just a little over 7.6% last week. That's the latest numbers that we have. That's been a very sharp increase, and it's been a real shock to the system, because as you look there, you will see this is the history of mortgage rates going back to 1970. But if you go from starting in 2010, we've been in an era where mortgage rates have been below 5%. And that's an abnormally low level of mortgage rates. By the way, on these charts, when you see those blue shaded bars, those represent the official dates of recession. So in 2008, 2009, that was the Great Recession that followed the financial crisis back in 2008. And since then, we've been in this world of very, very low mortgage rates. Prior to that, we never saw rates that were as low as this. I mean, these were historically low mortgage rates. And it was going on for about 15 years, and we got really used to thinking of that as being normal. If you've heard my presentations that I've given over the past several years, those were not normal mortgage rates. When I think about what the 30-year fixed mortgage rate ought to be, I just try and add up the components that go into it. One is what we call the real, meaning not taking into account inflation or inflation adjusted, risk-free interest rate. It's essentially how much does a lender have to be paid just to give up consumption for the future, okay? And I'm going to call that real risk-free rate about 2%, but I'll discuss in a few minutes how there's some debate over where that is. But just 2%, kind of roughly the real growth rate of the economy. Then you need to add in expected inflation. Well, if we're going to hit that Fed's inflation target of 2%, that's another 2% that we need to build in. And then we need to build in a premium for risk. Okay, that mortgages are riskier than other types of debt. They're not risk-free. And therefore, we need to build in maybe another 1.5% to 2% there. So just with everything that I've added up there, we're in a 5.5% to 6% range. And in my view, anything that would be between, say, 5.5% and 7.5% would be a normal range for mortgage rates in a world where we have good, solid economic growth, we're not in a recession. We have low, stable inflation that's expected to stay that way. And there's nothing funky going on in financial markets. And I've used that technical term before. So you look back here, we've been in a funky world ever since 2010. And what was that funkiness in financial markets? It has been the Fed directly buying mortgage-backed securities. And so direct intervention that has kept mortgage rates artificially low. Okay? We need to get out of the mindset of thinking that that extraordinarily low interest rate environment is normal. Even saying that, however, transitions matter, and adjusting to the new level of mortgage rates that we're in is not necessarily fun. It's kind of like the first time that it turns 30 degrees outside, we think that it's really, really, really cold. Well, come February or March, when we've been down there below 0 for several weeks, we'll think 30 degrees was really warm. Sometimes it's just altering your perspectives of how you're thinking about this. The other thing that I wanted to mention on this is that, I think the era that we were in the late 90s and early 2000s is a very typical range of mortgage rates that I've described. You go to those earlier periods where you had the really high mortgage rates in the late 70s and early 80s. That was all being driven by high inflation. Okay? So, with that all being said, what I think normal should be, right now we're just on that high end or maybe a little bit above the high end of normal. And what do we think mortgage rates will be going forward? Because that's what will really affect us in thinking about our housing markets in the coming year. And it's my belief that mortgage rates are going to be coming down over the next year. And I want to show you kind of using those three pieces, why is it that I think that's the case? Well, on this picture, the focus of this is going to be on inflation expectations, and there are 3 lines here. The top line is just that 30-year fixed mortgage rate. I'm sorry, wrong chart. The top line here is headline inflation, okay? So this is the year-over-year change in the consumer price index. We are all very familiar how inflation topped out about 8% a year or so ago. And since then, it has been coming down, okay? But headline inflation is a backward-looking thing, okay? It's what have the price changes been over the previous year. But what mortgages are going to be based on is what we think inflation will be going forward. And so the red line is a survey of households. And we ask the households, what do you think the inflation rate will be over the next 12 months? And so you can see that even when inflation got really high, household expectations for inflation, while somewhat elevated, were not nearly as high as the headline number. We bought a little bit into that transitory inflation. But the line that I want to point you to is the third line at the bottom, the green line. And if you were here last year, I think we talked about this, and I explained this. This is called the 5-year break-even rate. And it's calculated by looking at treasury securities that are issued by the federal government. And with the traditional treasury security, you give the federal government some money, and then they pay you interest every 6 months. And at the end, they pay you back. If you gave them $1,000 for that security, they give you back the $1,000 at the end. Okay? But there's no adjustment for inflation. You know, the dollars you get back won't buy as much as you did. So you have to build into that interest rate compensation for that inflation. But there's a different type of treasury security called TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Security. And with that security, again, you give the federal government $1,000. At the end of every 6 months, they give you interest based on the coupon rate on that bond. But then at the end of the year, they go and they say, how much actual inflation happened? And they increase the principal balance, or the par value of that bond, to account for actual inflation that occurred. So if we had, say, that 8% inflation, the value of that bond would go up from 1,000 to 1,080. The next year, the interest that you get would be based on that higher inflation-adjusted amount. The same thing would happen the year after that, and every single year for, say, 5 years. And at the end, the principal that you get paid back reflects not just the original $1,000 you gave the federal government, but all the inflation that happened over that 5-year period. Now, why that particular security is interesting to us is that the difference in the interest rate between the traditional treasury security and this TIPS security reflects what financial markets believe inflation will be over the coming 5 years. Investors are betting literally hundreds of billions of dollars in these securities. And whether they choose to buy a traditional treasury or TIPS treasury security really depends on whether or not they think that the yield differences that they're giving them are compensating them correctly for inflation. So if you look at that, what we're really saying here is that financial markets, which again are betting hundreds of billions of dollars on this, they believe that inflation over the next 5 years will average 2.2%. Okay? That gives me confidence that we have really gotten inflation under control, and that the inflation premium that's going to be worked into other interest rates is going to be relatively modest. Financial markets aren't telling us they need more. Okay? So that's one reason why I think things are good. Okay? We're not going to see an increase because of expected inflation. The second thing is what's happening with that real risk-free interest rate. And to talk about this, I want to point you to the red line in the middle there. That is the 10-year Treasury security, the traditional Treasury security. That is a nominal interest rate, and so it does include inflation premium built into it. But essentially, if you say, okay, we've got this 2% inflation premium, then that risk-free interest rate is the 10-year Treasury. You subtract off 2%. That's what that real risk-free rate is. Here's the point that I want to highlight with this. Over the last, again, since the financial crisis, that 10-year Treasury was averaging about 2%. Okay? Really, really, really low. That, in my view, was never a sustainable place to be. The recent increase that we've seen in the 10-year Treasury is really getting us back to a more normal level of, say, 4.5%. Subtract off that 2% inflation premium, that'd be at 2 2.5% real risk-free rate. I think we're back to normal with this. Notice that back in the early 2000s, that's about where we were. The 10-year Treasury right now is about the same as it was back in the early 2000s before the financial crisis. In my view, we won't see that 10-year Treasury go up significantly unless we have additional inflation that we're not expecting at this point. Okay? Now, why? Let me. Trying to think of which thing I want to say next, because there's so many pieces to this puzzle. The one other thing I want to mention is that I believe that we're back normal and that we won't come down from here, but there are other economists, including Paul Krugman, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he writes a column for the New York Times, that believe that demographic changes that we've seen in the United States, particularly our low population growth and low birth rates, will lead and have led to a lower permanent real risk-free interest rate. That means that he thinks the Treasury rates that we were at, say, a year ago, are more normal than where we are today. His view is that the 10-year Treasury will fall over time. Mine is that we're about back to normal. We don't know who's right. I'm certainly not going to argue too vehemently with a Nobel Prize winner. But even he acknowledges that this is a matter of a great deal of debate among economists. Okay? If the Treasury falls the way that we have, the way that Paul Krugman says it might, then that would actually put further downward pressure on mortgage rates. And why do I say that? Well, look at the blue line at the top and compare it to the red line. The 30-year fixed mortgage rate, you'll notice that it moves pretty much in lockstep with the 10-year Treasury, right? That is the benchmark rate that's really driving the 30-year mortgage rate. Now, where I'm most optimistic is reflected in the green line at the bottom. So if you look at that, that is the difference between the 30-year fixed mortgage rate and the 10-year Treasury rate. It's the risk premium component that I talked before for mortgages. And historically, and we're going all the way back to 1985 here, that's averaged about 1.7% or a little below 2%. Occasionally it gets a little bit higher, but when it gets higher up, to like a 3% risk premium, everybody follow what I mean by that risk premium? Clear? This difference between those rates. When it gets to be a big difference for mortgages, it typically goes back to the normal level relatively quickly. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that right now, the mortgage risk premium is especially high. It's almost 3%, which is exceptionally high. We've only hit that a couple of other times over the past, since 1985. And again, I don't know why the mortgage risk premium got so high right now, but I take comfort in the fact that in the past, when it's gotten high like this, it has come down relatively quickly back to that. 1.7 is the average, but let's call it even a 2% point. And here's my takeaway from that. If we see expected inflation stay under control the way that I think it is, and if we say the 10-year Treasury is going to stay about where it is, that real risk-free rate is back to normal, but if the risk premium for mortgages falls to its normal level, that gives us room for 30-year fixed mortgage rates to drop a full percentage point from where they are right now, just because we're, again, getting back to normal. Does that make some sense? Now, if Paul Krugman is right, and the real risk-free rate is actually lower, then that would actually cause mortgage rates to fall even further. So, again, I think the pressure and the tendency is going to be for mortgage rates to fall going forward, not to increase. And the only thing that would cause them to increase substantially from where they are is if we had inflation really start to rear its head up again. Okay? Questions about that?
You keep using the word normal and predictors and things.
Yeah.
But I mean, in you and Paul is one of us. You know, right now we've got a war going on in Europe, we've got a war going on in the Middle East, and we're financing both of them. So how can anybody predict inflation with us spending billions? The federal government spending billions, you know, in normal treasury rates and those things. How can we predict them?
So the question here is, how can we predict inflation when we've got all of these other things going on, especially some of the deficit spending that's going on in the federal government? And I'm going to turn it away from inflation, and I'll just kind of, the short answer is no, we can't really predict inflation very well, okay? When I was with the Federal Reserve in Cleveland, we were instructed, whenever someone asks you what's going to happen with interest rates, your answer is they will fluctuate. And you can see that's a correct answer, right? They fluctuate. But one thing that is, there's been a lot of debate in the financial world about what's been causing, very recently here, the increases that we've seen in the 10-year Treasury, okay? And some of that is a question of, are we reaching a place where the deficit spending by the federal government is getting to a place where we're outpacing the appetite of investors to buy U.S. Treasury debt? We'll see. I am very concerned about deficits and about the fiscal situation of the federal government long term. I am less concerned about it in the short term. So I don't think that's what's driving things here. But just as a side note, we need to get federal government spending and tax revenues in line with one another so that we're not continuing to increase the deficits that we have. But that's outside the scope of this area. I am relatively confident that the Federal Reserve will be very aggressive in its particular moves to try and make sure that whatever the federal government does, the fiscal side, does not roll over into inflation. They will put their priority on fighting inflation before they'll put the priority on just letting the federal government spend money.
Especially in an election.
And you know what? Everybody thinks the Fed is affected by election years. In all my time that I was there and in all the conversations I've had, it never crosses anyone's mind. They are insulated from who is in office at the time. And so it really doesn't affect their choices. So, you can agree or disagree, but I have no experience of them actually there. So, I think mortgage rates will fall next year, which means that we've got labor markets indicating strong demand for housing. Mortgage markets, yes, they're higher than they have been, but I think home buyers are going to acclimate to what is really a more normal level of mortgage rates. And if mortgage rates fall, that should give additional stimulus to demand. So what have we seen? By the way, I'm not the only one thinking mortgage rates will fall. Mortgage Bankers Association and the National Association of Realtors. Actually, I just got an updated Mortgage Bankers Association's forecast. They've adjusted theirs. Theirs now is essentially the same as NAR, 6% by the end of next year. I think that's still a little bit aggressive, and I'd go for 6.5% by the end of next year. But they've run the models, and I haven't, so I will use their numbers where I have to. So, what have we seen then in housing markets in Ward County and across the state of Kansas? It doesn't really. So the blue bars on here are the actual home sales that were in Ford County as reported by realtor boards across the state. And the red line is a moving average to get through the seasonality. And that lets you see a little bit of trends. It's a little bit hard to see this, but you'll notice that starting in 2019, we really bumped up from about 17 or 18 home sales a month to about 20 home sales a month. And that may not sound like a lot, but on percentage terms, that's a big increase. And it really had an impact. It started prior to the pandemic, but then the stimulus programs that we had in the wake of the pandemic really juiced up demand in housing markets. Demand has dropped off. You'll see we come down just a little bit in the last few months because of the increase in mortgage rates. This effect is even more notable when you look at it across the state and in larger markets across the state. Our forecast for home sales activity is that across the state, home sales will be down about 12.4% this year. That's less than the year-to-date figures that we've had so far. The declines so far year-to-date have been closer to 15% statewide. But I think we are past the worst of it. It was about October last year when the sales really started to be impacted by the higher mortgage rates. And so we're now at a place where we're going to level out compared to where we were last year. And that's what I forecast for 2024, is that home sales activity will be basically flat. And so the question? No, okay, I started to raise your hand. Yeah.
I know a question. So is part of the 12.4% decrease attributed to those individuals who have that low mortgage rate, not wanting to upgrade a home?
No, that not in that. Okay, that's a good question. So his question was, is part of this 12.4% decrease related to lock-in from people who have those really great mortgages? This is all essentially what this really is due to, the decrease that we saw in 2022 and 2023. The first part of the year, 2021, and the first part of 2022 were just absolutely skyrocketing sales activity. It was a frenzy in housing markets. And so some of that we stole future sales. And some of it was, they were so high, and they're just by coming down, were dropping off. Again, I think the worst is behind us on the sales declines. Will there be some lock-in effect? Probably some, but I think that's going to be relatively modest. And we can talk about that more in the question and answer section, why I'm not as concerned about lock-in effects. Excuse me. So, if I say, oh, demand is going to be strong, we've got a good labor market, mortgage rates are going to come down, why am I not forecasting an increase in home sales? And the answer to that is the lack of inventory, the limited supply of homes available for sale. And you can see that Ward County, you were averaging 100 homes available on the market, give or take, over the course of several years prior to the pandemic. And now you drop down to where you've got less than 50. So half the inventory that you had before. And that is a challenge that makes it difficult. Home buyers are out there, they like to buy, but finding what they want and being able to get it is a different question. There are a couple other things. One way we measure balance in the housing market is through this month's supply figure. If you have 100 homes on the market and you sell on average 20 homes a month, then 100 divided by 20, you have a 5-month supply of inventory. We think of a balanced market as that gray shaded region between a 4 and 6 month supply. And you can see that in the face of the pandemic, inventories got very, very tight in Ford County. You kind of get caught up with what's been going on across the larger markets in the state for a long time, really tight inventories. And that 2-month supply statewide and about 2.5 month supply in Ford County, that's incredibly tight. That means there's just not much available given the pace of sales that we have. A couple other ways we can look and say, yes, this really is leaning much more towards a seller's market. How fast are homes selling? Prior to the pandemic, the median days on market, the number of days that a house, so half of the homes would be on the market longer, half of the homes would be on the market a shorter time. We were looking at about 80 days on the market prior to the pandemic. You're now sitting below 50 days on the market. Again, much, much shorter time that we're spending homes looking before it actually sells. And then this one really tells a story. This is what percentage of homes that sell have actually had a sale price that's at or above the original listing price. Normally, we think there's this negotiation negotiation, right? You put your house on the market, it's available, and maybe I offer my house for 200,000, you offer me 180, we negotiate, I sell it for 190, that's below the original list price. That's the normal negotiation process we think of. Well, when it's a seller's market, like it had been over the past few years, you start to see people not offering much of a discount. So, no, you asking 200, I'll just offer 200. Or, because I'm afraid there are multiple offers out there, I will offer a price above your listing price. And you can see it's more than half of all homes in Ford County are selling either at or above the original list price. And even though the sales have dropped off just a little bit, again, it's not because demand has dropped off. And so, when you have that story, you see very rapidly rising home prices. This is the median sale price in Ford County. In terms of overall true home price appreciation, I'm past my time now, so I'll kind of save some things for questions later. But the one thing I wanted to note here is that median sale price can be affected by the composition of homes that sell. If all of a sudden some investor who owned 100 homes that were all these smaller little homes and they sold them all for $100,000 each, that would cause the median sale price in Ford County to drop. But that wouldn't mean that anybody's individual home price changed. It just meant we sold a lot more of the less expensive homes. Okay? This measure from the Federal Housing Finance Agency takes that into account and is a true measure of underlying same home to same home price appreciation. The thing I want you to take away from that is that really sharp appreciation that we saw. The blue line on this is non-metropolitan areas in Kansas. What this means is it wasn't just a big city phenomenon. We have seen real home price appreciation. So these increases that we've seen, it's not just that we're only selling expensive homes, it's that all homes have increased in value pretty substantially. That's the takeaway there. And our forecast is that home price appreciation is going to moderate back to a more normal level. This is not a collapse of some sort of price bubble in the real estate market. We're not going to appreciate at the torrid pace we did before. We're going to slow down. But notice 5.5%, 3.5%. That's really more normal rate of appreciation. The challenge with inventory is new home construction. The problems that you have in smaller communities of being able to build new homes that you can actually meet the price range that people can afford, that's now a problem in big cities too. And so I'll save the rest of that for conversations during the question and answer session at the end. But I will just give one last thanks again to Security First Title, and I'll pass it on so that we have time for our city manager to share with us all the great things going on in Dodge City. So with that, thank you very much.